Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Episode 66. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today I'm joined by Tony Eaude, and he recently did a lecture for the National Association for Primary Education as part of their Christian Schiller lectures, and I think it was very well received and a very interesting topic, so I thought it'd be great to have a conversation and just share this lecture with you as well and some of his great insights. So welcome, Tony. Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
So could you give us a little bit about your professional background and your educational experience?
I trained to be a primary teacher at Goldsmiths College in 1975-6, and then I was a primary class teacher for about 13 years. I then became a head teacher in a multicultural school in Oxford, in England, for 9 years. I then went off and did a doctorate, and I've worked for about the last 15 years or so as an independent consultant, author, writer, working with groups of teachers and children.
Fantastic. And what was the crux of the lecture? What was the impetus behind the lecture itself?
Well, I've been very concerned for a long time about primary education and education more generally becoming too narrow and rather soulless, too concerned with data in a narrow area of the curriculum. And when I was asked to do the Schiller lecture, I decided to choose the topic of what I called re-humanising primary education, because I was concerned that perhaps we've lost some of the most important aspects of primary education, which is to do with the relationships between children and teachers, and that the schools have become rather too soulless and not always meeting the most important needs of young children, especially in some areas to do with the humanities and the arts.
And what do you believe is a way to reconnect that? Is it more less testing and more focus on a wider curriculum, like you say, with the humanities and the arts, or is it a bit more of a personal approach in terms of actually? I've talked before on the podcast about actually having more of an idea of the story of the children and them as human beings, really, and their education through actually who they are as a starting point, rather than just a curriculum input.
Well, it's a bit of each, but it's more of the second of what you're saying. I mean, I think we do over-test children. I think that the curriculum has focused far too much on content, knowledge, and on a whole range of skills, which, while they're important, they're not really what the most important aspect of what I would call the education of the whole child is. So it's much more, I think, it's much more to do with the sorts of experiences and relationships which we offer to children, so that they develop a very broad range of skills and experiences, but in particular how they come to understand themselves in relation to the sort of complex and difficult world which they encounter. So as I said, while it's important, I think, that we look at changing some of the curriculum and some of the assessment procedures, that in itself won't really resolve the issue that I'm really trying to talk about, which is much more about the sorts of environments, the sorts of relationships that we build up, so that children are helped to understand themselves and the world that they live in.
And can you give us some examples of what that might actually look like in your sort of ideal world of how a school would work?
Well, I think if you think about walking into a school or walking into a classroom, one picks up very quickly the feel of the place or the ethos. Now, that's very hard to pin down. It's certainly something which I think isn't measurable, but it's what one feels in terms of a place being welcoming, being lively, being the sort of place where you as a learner or you as a parent would want the child to be. So it is very hard to put one's finger on, certainly in terms of anything measurable. But I think in terms of experience, it's something that most of us have a very strong feeling about. And I think particularly that's true for children and for young children. But the sort of examples that I would probably give would be the way in which teachers welcome the children, the sorts of responses that they give both to children and to parents, the ways in which teachers are able to remember and to make reference to maybe some of the lovely things and some of the more difficult things that happen in children's lives. Whether it's the fact that over the weekend they were, going to some special event, or maybe they had a brother or sister who, hadn't been very well, or any of those sorts of things which are maybe not sometimes so much associated with school learning in the sense of literacy or numeracy or music or science or whatever. But they're actually really at the heart of how we are as people and how we learn to be the sort of people that we want to become. And I suppose I would also want just to add at this point that I think this is what the best primary teachers do, and it's why often primary class teachers are the sorts of people whom adolescents and then adults very often remember with great affection. So the whole of what I'm saying is not really an issue about criticising teachers as such. It's much more to do with the sort of broader environment which enables teachers to work in the sorts of ways I've just been trying to describe.
And I guess in order to do that, is it really time that's the biggest factor, so that they can actually feel that they're not having to literally schedule every minute of every day, so they've got that ability to have that conversation which will be individual, which would just allow them to be able to have that? Or is it can it still be done within sort of the current confines, do you think?
I think time is a factor, and it's a very important factor in the way that you said. But I think it isn't just that. I think it's more about a whole different way of seeing education, and that's what I was trying to discuss in the lecture. That we have tended to see education as some sort of a frantic race, that where one has to cover the whole curriculum, one has to do all of the stuff in order to pass tests and so on. And I used the example in the lecture of seeing education much more like a sort of series of guided rambles, or sort of moving through the museum of life, rather than this sort of sprint race. Because I think the problem is, as soon as one starts to see education as too much of a race, that inevitably means that lots of children get left behind. And I'm not against competition as such, but I do think it's become too competitive. So to go back to the point about time, I think, yes, we have an overfull curriculum. We have too much emphasis on testing in a narrow range of particular outcomes. But really, the more basic thing that I'm trying to get at is about trying to build relationships where teachers respond to children and to their wonderful comments, their eccentricities, their difficulties, whatever, their misconceptions, their ideas, all of those sorts of things. And I think as soon as one starts to think about education in that different way, you suddenly realise that while planning is important, of course it is, but that actually if you get into a situation where you plan everything right down to the last minute, then you lose all the opportunities, or many of the opportunities, to respond to what children say, to what they're doing, and those sorts of things. So it's a whole different way of sort of seeing the educational process, which in some ways is much more relaxed, and it's much more reciprocal, so that it's more like a conversation. And I think the difficulty is if we get caught into this sort of what I described as a sort of frantic race, that we lose some of the most important things that young children in particular really need.
And I often find, certainly in my experience, is that those are the kind of conversations and the kind of understanding that children get when they reach a point in their life where they might be struggling. So when a child's identified as actually they need extra support, or they know there might be something at home which is actually something that the school needs to be aware of and they need support with, then they get that time and they get that extra bit of interest in those conversations and the ability to discuss those things. I think it's often the people in the rest of the class who are perfectly happy and just doing what they do in school, that without that special focus, they're the ones missing out in some ways on that thing in the current scenario. And actually having that time and that understanding for everybody, I think would really make a big difference from that point of view.
Yeah, no, I agree, and again I go back to the point that actually I think really good primary teachers, of whom there are thousands and thousands, that actually they do this, but very often they do it in spite of and against the flow of policy. One of the things that I wanted to highlight just from what you just said, and it's something about where I particularly came from in terms of my own interest in education, is the whole issue of social disadvantage and those who come from difficult backgrounds. And one of my particular worries about the narrowing of the curriculum is that it further disadvantages those who are already disadvantaged. And I think it's a bit counterintuitive, but I think it's true that if children are finding it difficult to learn to read and write and to learn mathematics, there's a sort of tendency to say, well, then they need to do more and more of that. And I think that's what's happening in schools. Whereas my experience, and the experience of a lot of research as well, is that actually those are precisely the children who most benefit from the broader experiences which come through making things, through art, through music, through visits to museums or churches or the locality and those sorts of things. So I think there is a real issue around how the narrowing of the curriculum actually further disadvantages children who are already finding learning difficult. Whereas I think, and this is, I know, a broad generalisation, that I think many children who come from more advantaged backgrounds they will actually get many of those experiences outside of school.
Yes.
And that it's one of the really important roles of schools is to offer the opportunities to all children, but particularly to those who wouldn't otherwise get those broader experiences outside of school.
And in terms of Christian Schiller and the lecture itself, how was your lecture and the focus of it influenced by his research and his work?
Well, Schiller wasn't a researcher as such. He was someone who worked for many years as one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and did a great deal of work with teachers and with head teachers. So much of his work was quite practical. But one of the things that really struck me very strongly, and it goes back to what I've just been saying, is that he worked for many years as a youngish inspector in the Liverpool area, and which was an area of desperate poverty in the 1920s. And he was appalled by the living conditions in which many of those pupils lived. Now, that's understandable, but he was also appalled by the fact that when he went into the elementary schools that they visited, they were very often given a dull and narrow diet of learning, which didn't engage them at all. But actually, when he then spoke to them about their experiences outside of school, he very often found that they had a sort of wealth of experience and knowledge which wasn't either recognised in school or developed by the elementary schools. And from that he developed a very strong sense that actually the narrow curriculum of the elementary school needed to be changed, and then did a great deal of that over the next 30 or 40 years of his life. And in fact, when I was a young teacher, much of the ways of working to which I was introduced, with a very strong emphasis on the probably not calling it the humanities, but the humanities, the arts, physical movement, those sorts of areas, a love of reading, all of those sorts of aspects, they were seen as much more important than I think they are in schools now. So I sort of drew on that aspect of Schiller's work, but also his belief that change comes really from the bottom up. Now, if you say that alone is too simple, because obviously all teachers work within a policy context, and the curriculum and the assessment procedures, one has to take account of those. But really what he said is that if you're going to change people's attitudes and beliefs profoundly, then one actually really needs to work with teachers and to trust teachers more. And so another aspect which I think is really important from Schiller's legacy in relation to the situation over the last 20 or 30 years is that politicians particularly have come not to trust teachers. I think individual parents often have great trust in teachers, but there is sort of underlying the whole discussion about primary education particularly a sort of sense that teachers need to be told what to do, whereas my belief is that actually there is a huge wealth of experience on which we can draw, and that actually teachers understand individual children and children's needs far better than politicians do, and that if we're really going to start the process of change from the current situation, which in many ways I deplore, then actually we need to recover much of that trust in teachers. But going along with that, and again I discuss this in the lecture, is that teachers must learn to be much more confident in articulating what their skill and their professionalism is. And I think sometimes teachers have been a bit self-deprecating, and it's really important that we try to work out and to make more public some of the aspects of really what good teachers of young children actually do. And I've done quite a bit of work in my own writing about this, because I think it's quite difficult. You look at somebody teaching a class of young children, and it looks easy, it looks effortless, and you go and try and do it, and you find it's very, very hard. And so I think it's really important that teachers as a profession both recover some of their own belief in themselves, which I think has been lost to some extent over the last 20 or 30 years, but also find ways of articulating what it is that makes for good teaching. And some of that, I think, is very much to do with the sorts of relationships we were talking about a few minutes ago, and how one builds up an environment where young children have a broad range of opportunities, and where they actually learn to become confident learners in all sorts of ways.
And getting that feeling from the teacher's point of view to want to get that out into the community, and also from a public point of view, do you think that change will come through the voice of organisations or unions in terms of trying to get that into the media and into people's perceptions, or is it much more organic than that in terms of their relationships with their immediate community, obviously their students, but then also the parents, and actually having a much more sort of holistic kind of feel of what the school is, and sort of gradually that ethos sort of spilling out almost into everyone's sort of idea of what teaching is and the children's learning?
I think it's a really tricky question, that. I think, to take the way that you have put it, the immediate aspect is the second part of what you're saying, which is that one needs to do it within one's own school community, within the wider community, and with parents. But I'm not convinced that then just sort of spills out into the wider political arena.
Yeah.
And of course, not all teachers are, going to want to or be able to influence the broader political agenda. So there is a place for organisations like NAPE and the subject associations, teacher unions, and so on. But I don't think that happens automatically. And as I was saying in relation to Schiller in the lecture, it's a difficult and arduous journey that one needs to take. And I thought a lot about the reasons for this. And I think it's very tricky for politicians to avoid, again, this sort of sense of the frantic race and the sort of league tables. And that if in the results of PISA, which is the international league tables, that we've slipped from 9th to 13th. Oh, well, then we've really got to sort of bring in a new curriculum or whatever. And again, that's why I come back to this point about a different way of thinking about education, which I think is tricky for politicians, because, they're judged very often on results. But I think as soon as you get caught into that whole way of thinking, then you get somewhat trapped into, we need to do more in order to get our scores up. And I think that in the end, that's A, it probably doesn't work, and B, and more importantly, that what we really need to be looking at is something much more to do with the aims of education in a complex and difficult world. And I think there's far too little discussion about the aims of education and what it is to be an educated person in the 21st century. And I think there's a sort of implicit belief that actually if everybody had high scores in tests, then everything would be fine in the world of education. And we all know that that isn't true. I mean, just to take one example, there's rightly a great deal of worry about young people's mental health. And I think there's strong evidence now that there is a link between that and this sort of frantic competitive race, to score highly in tests and exams. And so the whole thing is sort of tied together, that because we get so obsessed with exam results, that then puts pressure on children, which then tends to make them lack resilience and to become fragile. And I think we sort of need to step back and say, what are the sorts of aims of education based on what is it to be an educated person for the 21st century? And I think as soon as you start to think in that sort of way, and interestingly, the CBI, the employers' organisation, did this back in 2012, so it's not just about teachers doing that. But my own thinking and lots of other people, as soon as you start thinking about that, you then say, well, we really need, it's things like qualities that one's talking about, qualities such as creativity and resilience and teamwork, those sorts of aspects of children which we need to build up, rather than filling them up with lots of facts, or indeed focusing too much on a whole range of discrete skills. So it's something about thinking about what is it that we want to achieve in terms of the whole child. So just to give one example, of course I want children to be literate and numerate, but I don't just want them to be that. I want them to be confident, I want them to be resilient, I want them to be able to work with other people, to be empathetic with those who are different, not to be stereotyped and prejudiced. So it becomes a complicated thing. But I think that as soon as you start to think about that in those ways, you then recognise the role of the arts, the humanities, and a whole range of other aspects of the curriculum, which at the moment I think are too often marginalised.
So, a change in the curriculum from that point of view, I think we probably both agree would make a massive difference. The thing I'm often interested in is the fact that, I guess because you say of policy and because of politicians, their life is relatively short-lived, and so they need to see results in the next year, the next cycle of tests, and all of that kind of thing. But even within that, you can see that if you take countries like Finland, who educate their children in a different standpoint, and with a broader curriculum and age when they start school and all of that kind of thing, they do it differently and seem to be very successful in what they do. And the other side of the coin is that you hear businesses say, we want the qualities that you've just been talking about as well, which would therefore, from an economic point of view and a work point of view, would be very beneficial for the country. So what is it that you think is the sticking point, that they don't think, there must be something there that we could do, because we can already see there are things out there, either from different countries or from the wider world, that are actually saying we want these skills as well, which we're not getting from the current education system. If league tables were the most important thing and we were at the top by a mile, then I could understand the politicians saying, yes, but it's working, whether we agree with it being working from a human point of view. But we're not even there yet either. So I find, what are your thoughts on maybe why there isn't a light bulb moment going off of but we're not actually achieving what we're saying we're trying to achieve anyway, so why not do it somewhat differently?
What you say sets off two or three trains of thought, and I'll try and pick all three up. I think the first one is I am sympathetic to politicians for the reasons that you say, the business of short term, and what I was saying about the need to show results. But I think also politicians do have a role in terms of leadership. And as I said earlier, I think it's very easy to get caught into this frantic race of comparing with other countries. And I think it's generally not terribly helpful. And I think really is important for politicians. I don't think many of them do it, or certainly not political parties. To go back to what I was saying before about, what is it that we want out of an education system? And I think I'm very disappointed that really there's been very little discussion about that, as I see it, in terms of of political parties within the last 20 or 30 years. Just to pick up on the point about comparisons with other countries, I think one needs to be always slightly wary about this. Finland, as you say, is often sort of brought in as an example, and I'm a great admirer of the Finnish system, and I think the point that you referred to about the starting age of school is an important one, and I think we do have a particularly English obsession with getting children into school younger and younger. And even more important than that, in many ways, it's not just about when we get them into school, but actually then get them into a particular approach to schooling,
yes,
which is wholly inappropriate, it seems to me. And I think the loss of a play-based curriculum, which we can see works particularly well in the Scandinavian countries, I think that's a particularly worrying aspect in terms of 4 and 5-year-olds. I'm rather tired of hearing politicians saying that we ought to go to the Far East, to see how they teach maths. Now, I think there are certain ways in which, one can learn from other systems, but I think one needs to be a bit wary of that. And I think in terms of learning from other countries, there's a lot to be said for learning from systems which are quite similar to ours. And although I don't know a great deal about what's happened in Scotland, I think actually that's perhaps a country because in many ways it's more similar, obviously, than the Far East or the Scandinavian countries, where we probably have a lot to learn in terms of the sort of breadth of the curriculum and also the engagement of parents in the community. You see, I think we have an extraordinary situation whereby if you look at 4 and 5-year-olds, certainly most of them have a very imaginative, fairly wide-ranging, not too narrow a view of learning. Now, of course, they don't have the experience that older children and adults have, but they certainly aren't nearly as constrained by subject boundaries or some of the beliefs about learning which we as adults tend to impose on them. And I mean, one of the things that somebody said, I forget who now, is, thank heavens that children learn to talk before we try and teach them to talk. Because if we try to teach them to talk in the way that we teach them to read, then actually we would make it more difficult. And I think quite often we do make learning more difficult for children than actually it is in a much more natural way. So I think many of the most important things that children learn, they learn in a fairly natural and unforced way. And of course they need guidance and so on, and that's what teachers and parents and others can offer. But I think we do get into this very strange situation where 4 and 5-year-olds very often arrive at school with many of the qualities that, as you say, employers are looking for. And of course education isn't just for employment, it's also for life, but it's for employment is part of life. And somehow we have a schooling system which manages to squeeze, many of those things out of the children, and then they get to 15 or 16, and for some reason we're then surprised that actually, they're no longer able to, to manifest those qualities, or many of the children aren't. So, I mean, I think just as an example, how do you learn teamwork? It seems to me you learn teamwork basically by working with other people. I mean, to some extent with those who are similar, but also with those who are different. And you learn, to make use of a whole range of different skills and approaches from different people. And yet we have a highly individualized system, which is then backed up by, by the testing regime. If we want to encourage teamwork, which I believe is an absolutely key quality for life in general, particularly in the 21st century, then actually we need to encourage much more cooperative learning. Similarly with creativity, if we want children to be creative, then actually that needs to run right the way through the whole approach. Creativity, I think, isn't something which just happens within inverted commas creative subjects. So music, art, and those things, of course, they can contribute to creativity, but actually I believe learning is a creative process, so that actually in every subject there are opportunities for creativity, but too often we end up trying to impose particular views of learning on children, whereas actually we need much more, I think, to run with the flow of how children learn, and then to be facilitating and adapting. Whereas I think we've got caught, particularly in England in the last 20 or 30 years, into a view of teaching which is that it's much more to do with instruction as opposed to facilitation. Now, I mean, there's a place for both, but I think we need much more to see teachers as enablers and facilitators rather than sort of deliverers and instructors.
And that really almost goes full circle in terms of giving them that sense of power they feel to actually be the teachers that they can be, because when you're enabling and facilitating, then it's not about the planning at all, then it's having that overall idea of where you think it might be going, which may then go in a completely different direction as well, but then you're able to use those skills and that understanding and that experience to help the child learn whatever it is that they want to do in that particular environment, I guess.
No, I think that's right, and it's also where teachers need to have the confidence to do that. And one of the concerns that I have is that while I think we have a generation of teachers who are extremely efficient, probably far more efficient in many ways than I was as a teacher, in terms of their planning and curriculum coverage and those things, that actually they very often will find it quite difficult to deal with what is unexpected. So they may be able to deliver a planned lesson very, very well, but actually when a child then, or a group of children, come up with an interesting question or sort of go off piste, so to speak, then actually they find it very difficult to know how to follow that line. So Michael Oakeshott, who's a philosopher from many years ago, talked about education being a conversation between the generations, which I think is a lovely phrase. The idea that it's much more like a conversation where it goes back and forth, and that we explore as adult and child, or adult and class, we explore something, and each side says what they think, and one then enriches one's thinking, as opposed to what I think one too often sees is the adult standing in front of the class and telling children what to learn. And ultimately don't think that's really how children learn.
No, and I think certainly from my experience with our children going through the education system, it's certainly not those what I guess would be considered normal days of that kind of being spoken to and being taught to, that aren't the ones where they've come home and gone, you'll never guess what we did. They came from much more the more creative, the visits out of school, and that slightly more enriched day, for whichever reason that happened to be their experience in that particular scenario.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, of course, it's a bit simple to focus on the memorable things,
of course, yeah.
Because actually, a lot of what we have to learn is a bit of a struggle, and maybe sometimes it's a bit tedious. But I in the lecture, I talk about some of the memorable moments, such as I remember going with my father. I remember badgering my father because of my history teacher to say, look, I want to go to Stonehenge. And I mean, in those days, you could literally walk up to the stones at Stonehenge and touch them and get the sense of it. And I would have been 9 or 10 probably, and I vividly remember that. And I just think that has a quality of experience and understanding of history in this case, and of human culture, which I think can't ever be replicated by the best lesson, and which has remained with me, whatever it is, 45 years later.
And
55, sorry.
Yes. And we talked a little bit about the fact that sort of the way of teaching now is sort of 20, 30 years into a cycle. And so therefore there must be an awful lot of head teachers now which don't know any different. Their teaching days were in that same sort of guise, in that same sort of format. So do you see a sort of an ever-increasing spiral of the same, assuming that policy doesn't change dramatically, or is there a way of that changing because the actual leadership? I mean, I guess I've always thought that the leadership in that ethos comes from the person who wants to set the agenda for the school, and if they don't fully understand that in a way that they might have done sort of pre this sort of policy idea, how that sort of then gets back into the school. I mean, other than the sorts of conversations that we're having, hopefully, in people listening to these sorts of things.
To pick on the first point that you were saying, I agree, but in fact I think it's even more worrying than that, because I think that it isn't just the senior leaders, their experience as teachers, but many of them, it's actually their experience as learners in school as well. Yeah. So actually they've had relatively little experience, many of them, of the sort of approach that I'm talking about. And I think that makes it very difficult for people not to think of education in terms of a race and in terms of measurable outcomes, and that's basically what learning and teaching is about. And I think it then goes back to what we were discussing earlier, really. I think it's tricky to see how one changes that, except by a whole... Well, I think there's the bottom-up aspect of actually talking about what are we about as educators, as we were saying a few minutes ago. There's all sorts of issues to do with teacher education, which I think is problematic just because it's so short. And I don't believe that one learns to become something as complex as a teacher just on a very short course. As I said earlier, I am a great believer in the sort of bottom-up, but how that then influences the policy agenda, I think, is difficult to know, except by the sorts of discussions that we're having at the organisations, and constant arguing for the sort of vision that I'm trying to promote. But I think if I was going to do one thing as a politician, I know you haven't asked me this, but one or two people have in the past, that I think actually many schools are very, very driven by Ofsted. And I think that if Ofsted were to, I would like to see quite a reform of Ofsted, but even if one didn't do that, I think if they actually had to report on the breadth and balance of the curriculum, and also on another area that I'm particularly interested in, which is spiritual, moral, social, cultural, if there was much more emphasis within that, those sorts of areas, in the Ofsted framework and in how schools are inspected, then I think that would be liberating to many teachers and head teachers who I think remain very constrained by what they believe Ofsted is looking for. And when I speak to some heads, they say, well, actually Ofsted is much better than it was, and I think there's probably some basis for that. But again, I think there's still Ofsted is still very caught, and schools are therefore very caught that it's mostly about data and measurable outcomes in literacy and numeracy. And as I said earlier, of course, I think those things are important, but I want a much broader vision, a much richer vision of what it means to be an educated person. And sorry, just to add one thing, I'm also convinced by my discussions with teachers, particularly older teachers, I think, that actually the sort of vision that I'm trying to espouse is something that they would, because of their experience of children, that they would say, yes, we would love to do that, but actually it's very hard to find any time in the curriculum, to do those sorts of activities and field work. And I mean, just as one example, and I mean, it makes me weep, to be honest, that particularly in year 6 with the emphasis on SATs, that so many schools spend such a lot of time preparing for SATs, and then after they're over will then say, well, now we're going to do some of the other things that we really believe in. And I'm actually a great believer that of course one needs some emphasis on the skills of literacy and numeracy, but I learned to be fairly literate by the learning of history and geography, and by learning to write stories and literature and many of those things. So again, it comes back to my previous point about a whole different way of seeing what we want to achieve, and then the means to achieve that, whereas we're caught into a very, very narrow view of it.
So if people want to actually experience the lecture themselves, you've got it on your website, which if you're happy to, I'll put a link to, so that people can read it and really get their teeth into it in its full entirety. And
no, that would be great. And if people wanted to make any comments on that, and again, on the website, my email address is available.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for chatting to me. It's been a really interesting conversation, and we could stay here all day. I go round and round and round. But for those people listening, I hope that's given you an awful lot to think about, and just some things which maybe you could think about, implement differently, or just have different conversations with the people in your local community, be in the school and the parents, the governing body, and just to sort of give you a bit of empowerment, really, to that we can make a difference, and especially from the ground up, and just little bits every day then can make a difference to the future as a whole, we hope, anyway.
Thank you as well. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And just to pick on your last point, I think the idea of empowering teachers is a lovely one.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.